we have a pretty strong indication of where the remains of baby Emmanuel are. So that investigation is ongoing at this time.
The truth has surfaced. For weeks, the disappearance of baby Emmanuel Haro weighed heavy on Southern California. Flyers taped to poles. Candlelight vigils burning late into the night. Families whispering prayers that tomorrow might bring him home. But tonight, that hope has been replaced by a heartbreaking reality. Investigators have confirmed what many feared but desperately prayed would never be true. Emmanuel's remains are being discovered. This discovery changes everything. What began as a desperate rescue mission has now become a fight for justice. When Emmanuel was first reported missing, time instantly became the greatest enemy. Every tick of the clock carried the weight of uncertainty, and every second that passed felt like a door slowly closing on the chance of finding him alive. The community reacted in urgency. Flyers were printed in bulk and plastered across every corner of the neighborhood. Gas stations, schools, grocery stores, and light poles carried Emmanuel's face, his smile staring back at strangers who were now compelled to stop and take notice. Amber alerts blared on cell phones, cutting through the normal rhythm of the day, jolting people with a chilling message that a child was missing, and the window to save him was narrowing. Neighbors rallied together, forming search parties that combed through fields, desert brush, alleyways, and even abandoned buildings. People who had never spoken to one another before suddenly found themselves shoulder to shoulder, scanning ditches and drainage pipes. Families clung to the fragile hope that Emmanuel would be found playing somewhere, scared but safe. Prayers were whispered at kitchen tables and shouted in church pews. Parents gripped their children tighter, unwilling to let them out of sight. Volunteers walked block by block, checking behind sheds, under porches, and around playgrounds where laughter had once echoed. But as the hours stretched into days, cracks began to show, not just in the community's hope, but in the very story being told. Detectives began piecing together accounts, lining up the parents' statements with phone records, with sightings, with known timelines. And what they uncovered was troubling. Small contradictions surfaced first, times that didn't align, details that shifted slightly when repeated, words that faltered under the pressure of questioning. At first, these could have been chalked up to stress or trauma. But as investigators pressed harder, the inconsistencies became too glaring to ignore. That's when the tone of the investigation shifted. It was no longer just a frantic search for a missing boy. It became something darker, heavier. Detectives began to wonder if they were not chasing after a lost child, but instead unraveling a lie. And then came the moment, the turning point, that would change everything. Emmanuel's parents, Jake and Rebecca Haro, were arrested in a dramatic turn that shifted the case from a desperate search into a criminal investigation. The charges were severe, filing a false police report and facing the looming possibility of neglect and abuse allegations. For investigators, this was more than just a procedural step. It was a public acknowledgement that suspicion had turned inward, toward the very people who should have been protecting Emmanuel. When bail was announced at $1 million each, it sent a chilling message. Prosecutors were not treating this as a misunderstanding, nor as a family tragedy that spiraled out of control. They were making it clear this case was now being handled with the full weight of the law. For many who had been following the developments closely, the arrest came as little surprise. Whispers had been circulating, fueled by inconsistencies in the Haros statements and the tense body language captured during press conferences. Neighbors, who had once walked shoulder to shoulder in the search effort, now began to speak more freely. Some admitted they had long felt uneasy about Emmanuel's home environment. Others recalled seeing signs, small things, overlooked at the time, that suggested trouble behind closed doors. Then came the revelation that ignited outrage. This was in the Haro family's first encounter with the justice system. Court records exposed a troubling history. In 2023, just a year before Emmanuel's disappearance, Jake had been convicted in a child-related case. The nature of that conviction painted a disturbing picture. Yet instead of serving time behind bars, Jake had been granted probation, a second chance given by the system under the assumption that supervision and reform were enough to protect the children under his care. Now, that decision is under the harshest scrutiny. Critics asked whether Emmanuel's fate was sealed the moment leniency was extended. Could his disappearance and possible death have been prevented if stronger action had been taken earlier? Did the justice system fail him long before the night he went missing by prioritizing rehabilitation over protection? These are the questions now hanging over prosecutors, judges, and social workers alike, as the case transforms from a personal tragedy into a haunting indictment of systemic failure. The most chilling development came when investigators confirmed what the community had feared but prayed would never be true. Emmanuel's remains had been found. The announcement shook everyone who had followed the case from the beginning. Yet it left them with an agonizing question. Where? Authorities offered no immediate answers. No map, no precise address, not even a hint of the conditions under which the discovery was made. The press conference was carefully worded, and every sentence chosen with precision. To outsiders, the silence felt cold, even cruel, like the authorities were withholding something the public deserved to know. But for those familiar with how sensitive cases unfold, the silence was not a void. It was strategy, because in cases like this, every inch of ground where evidence is found becomes a crime scene of its own. Every fragment of soil can contain DNA. Every stray fiber or hair can link a suspect to the truth. Even the position of a bone or the angle of a disturbed branch can tell investigators a story that no words ever could. To reveal too much, too soon, would risk drawing a swarm of media, eager onlookers, or worse, people who might tamper with evidence, intentionally or otherwise. Investigators knew that for Emmanuel's story to be told with accuracy and integrity in a courtroom, the crime scene had to remain untouched, unsullied, and fully preserved. So they held back. They chose silence, not because they wanted to keep secrets, but because silence was the strongest shield they had in that moment. This wasn't the silence of indifference. It was the silence of protection. Protection of fragile evidence that could make or break the case. Protection of Emmanuel's story, ensuring that when the truth is spoken in court, it will be backed by undeniable proof. And most importantly, it was protection of justice itself, justice that Emmanuel could no longer fight for on his own. Every word unspoken, every detail withheld, was ultimately a step toward holding those responsible accountable for crime that stole his life. Now, the silence is broken. The stillness that once surrounded Emmanuel's disappearance has been shattered by the undeniable voice of the courtroom. Jake and Rebecca Haro have faced the bench, no longer shielded by uncertainty or speculation. Their every word, every gesture, was measured against the mountain of evidence prosecutors placed before the court. This was not a hearing filled with vague promises of justice sometime in the future. It was proof, concrete, undeniable, laid out piece by piece. Documents that traced timelines down to the minute. Testimony from those who saw, heard, and knew more than they had once admitted. Forensic evidence, gathered with painstaking care, each fragment carrying a weight that could not be ignored. What once circulated as rumor, whispered in corners of the community, was transformed into revelation under oath. Behind those courtroom doors, Emmanuel's story was not hidden, not speculated, not distorted. It was heard, loud, clear, and impossible to dismiss. The inconsistencies in the parent accounts, the contradictions that had plagued investigators for weeks, were laid bare before judge and jury. Every detail drew Emmanuel's memory closer to justice, ensuring that his life was not reduced to silence. Outside, the world held its breath. People were not simply waiting for updates anymore. They were watching. The courtroom became a stage where Emmanuel's truth began to surface for all to see. News outlets carried every development. Vigils doubled in size, and social media echoed with Emmanuel's name, ensuring he would not fade into obscurity. The silence that one protected lies is now being broken by revelation. And with that breaking comes momentum. The truth has begun to surface, not as whispers, not as speculation, but as undeniable fact. Emmanuel's voice, carried through evidence and testimony, has entered the public record. And from this point forward, the fight for justice is no longer a question of if, but how far the truth will reach. Through it all, the community has carried Emmanuel's memory like a flame that refuses to go out. In Cabazon and beyond, candlelight vigils have become sacred rituals, circles of light breaking through the darkness. Parents stand shoulder to shoulder with grandparents, their faces etched with grief but also with determination. Children, too young to understand the full weight of what has happened, clutch candles in their small hands, whispering prayers into the night. The glow of those flames reflects on tear-streaked cheeks, illuminating not just sorrow, but solidarity. For this community, Emmanuel is not just another headline on the evening news. He is not just a case number in a court docket. He is a symbol of innocence lost, of systems that must do better, and of every child who deserves love, safety, and protection. To speak Emmanuel's name at these gatherings is to speak for countless others who have been silenced too soon. Each vigil is both personal and universal, rooted in one boy's tragedy but resonating with a collective pain and urgency. These gatherings are not simply moments of mourning. They are acts of defiance. With each candle lit, the community sends a message that they will not allow Emmanuel to be forgotten, nor his story to fade into silence. They are demonstrations of resolve, born out of the conviction that justice must prevail, not only for Emmanuel, but for every child at risk of being failed by those entrusted with their care. The chants, the prayers, the songs sung softly beneath the stars all carry the same message. We will not look away. Neighbors who once walked the same streets without notice are now bound together by a shared vow to demand answers, to hold institutions accountable, and to keep pressing until the truth is fully uncovered. In those circles of light, Emmanuel's memory becomes more than sorrow. It becomes strength. It becomes a rallying cry, a reminder that communities have power, and that silence in the face of injustice is never an option. These vigils prove that even in grief, there is resolve. And in that resolve lies the promise of justice. The waiting is over. The hushed anticipation that gripped Cabazon and spread far beyond has given way to the reality of courtroom proceedings. The heavy wooden doors have opened and closed on the first chapter of Emmanuel's fight for justice. What was once speculation, rumor, and tense silence has now transformed into sworn testimony. The search for truth is no longer unfolding in backyards and desert fields, but within the walls of a court of law. Inside that room, prosecutors methodically laid out their case. Evidence was presented with precision, documents introduced, photographs displayed, timelines dissected under the sharp edge of cross-examination. Every contradiction in the parent accounts was highlighted, every inconsistency magnified under oath. What once existed as whispers of suspicion has been recorded as documented fact, preserved in transcript that will stand long after the proceedings conclude. The contrast was stark. On one side, prosecutors stood firm, presenting Emmanuel's story not as speculation, but as a chain of hard truths linked by evidence. On the other, the defense scrambled to counter, to explain away, to plant seeds of doubt where certainty was beginning to take root. Every statement carried weight. Every word echoed with the gravity of a life stolen far too soon. And yet, this was more than just a hearing. It was accountability unfolding in real time. For Emmanuel's community, watching closely, the verdict is not confined to the judge or the jury. It lives in the parents who refuse to let their children walk the same path. It lives in neighbors who choose not to stay silent when they see signs of danger. It lives in every voice demanding that Emmanuel's story remain in the light, never hidden in the shadows of legal jargon or forgotten in the endless churn of news cycles. The case has been heard. The evidence is powerful, clear, and devastating. But still, the fight is not finished. Because justice is never sealed in a single court date, it is a journey, long and often difficult. Emmanuel's name will echo through every step of that journey, carried by those who refuse to let him be silenced again. The silence is broken. The court has spoken. And the long road to justice for Emmanuel has begun.